she was bringing this up again, and now of all times, was beyond me. Fuck off, I growled low in my chest as I fought to ignore her. She really popped up at the most inconvenient moments, and I was in no mood for this argument. This dispute would always progress in an annoyingly predictable fashion. I start by reminding her that Esme's house didn't have a phone. Both she and Alice had their own cell phones, and they'd probably never had the need for the extra expensive one. On the other hand, Bella had never had the need for a cell phone. Thus, I concluded that there was no direct way to contact Bella by phone. To which my annoying and incorporeal companion would counter with a reminder that I could call Alice directly and she'd allow me to speak with Bella. To which I would counter that I wished not to bother Alice, and to which she would again counter with her doubt that Alice would be bothered. To which I would counter, fuck off. See? I was saving us a whole shitload of time.
But you want me to stay?
She murmured while twirling a lock of hair around her finger. It was so fucking disgusting. I couldn't decide which was more disturbing, her being here, or me actually acknowledging it every single time.
You want to talk to me, so why won't you pick up the phone and call?
She asked once again. I'm done talking to you, I informed her briskly. Bella had everyone back in forks, and I'd made certain that everyone knew that I'd wanted her looked after before I'd departed. I'd even enlisted Rosalie. M8 had told me what a difficult time she'd had while he was away, and I don't fucking know. I just felt like she could help my girl in some way that no one else could. I also asked her to stick by her side during school, since I knew that Bella would have difficulty walking to classes with Emmett or Jasper. Alice was a great friend and cousin to Bella, but nobody, and I mean nobody, fucked with Rosalie Hale. I knew after I'd called her that evening I'd be spending less time in Chicago worrying over Bella. If anyone touches her, I'll rip their fucking balls off, she'd assured me firmly, and then had added, or tits. Whichever. I'd heard her shrug around the phone, and I'd know that she was dead serious. Rosalie was hardcore like that. Bella was silent for a few moments before emitting a loud huff.
You know what, Edward?
She faced me then, ramrod in her seat, and I avoided her gaze as her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, seemingly unable to complete her thought. My thought. Shit, this was confusing.
Whatever.
She finally spat and sunk back into her seat, crossing her arms over her chest with a glower. I had made her angry. I suppressed a satisfied grin. Fine, I concluded, rather pleased that I had won an argument for once.
Fine.
She yelled in an enraged concession, her cleavage heaving with her huffs and glaring ahead. She was always grouchy like this right before she vanished. I closed my eyes and ground my teeth. I hated admitting that I wanted her here. I despised the notion that her presence offered me the smallest measure of comfort just because she looked like my girl. I hated the power she had over me because of this fact. I hated that she was about to leave, and I really fucking hated that I hated she was about to leave. Fine. I finally shouted back in annoyance, and when I opened my eyes, the seat beside me was vacant once again. I spent my time focusing very carefully on the yellow door to the building. It looked so goddamn abandoned that it was making me second-guess my intel. I probably could have called Carlisle to ask him for further assistance. He did have access to medical records and far more resources than I could ever manage to attain. But I couldn't call Carlisle, and even though I had been giving Red Bella idiotic excuses the past days of why I couldn't call Bella either, I knew it had nothing to do with cell phone logistics. I couldn't call any of them until I was sure that I could be better. Like Emmett. By 9, I had decided to leave and was checking the Volvo's fuel gauge in consideration of a fill-up. I reasoned that I could find my bearings later, but I was suddenly really fucking exhausted. Before I could turn the key in the ignition, I saw the yellow door shift slightly. My hand froze on the key, and my body stiffened in anticipation as it slowly opened. A woman with long dark hair emerged, covering her face from the morning sun, and closing the door behind her. She was wearing a long, brown trench coat that stopped at her calves and hid most of her form. I strained over my dashboard to catch a glimpse of her face, but she was already down the steps and walking in the opposite direction. I released a breath I didn't realize I was holding, and my heart was suddenly thudding wildly in my chest at the mere glimpse of a woman who may or may not have been my mother. There was no fucking way I was going to make it to her door, if and when she returned. I let my head fall to my seat with a shuddering exhale, and waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I just had this feeling I should. My eyes closed for a few moments, but I opened them abruptly when I realized the risk involved. I watched a couple children traveling on the sidewalk with school bags on their backs. I shook my head quickly to stop that train of thought. It'd be out soon. She returned after only 12 minutes, with a brown paper bag clutched to her stomach. Her head was angled toward the ground, but I could see her face more clearly as she approached her building. It had to be her. I'd spent hundreds of nights sketching her face, and though this face looked more sallow, older, and pale, I was 90% confident it was the same person. The realization had me rigid in my seat. I watched her climb the steps and open the door to disappear inside. She didn't need to unlock it. I allowed this detail to distract me, and I somehow managed to spend 50 minutes dissecting it in my mind. She took a senseless risk by not locking her door. Then I decided it wasn't so much a dissection, as much as a really shitty method of noting the obvious. By 11, I'd grown weary with watching the door in anticipation of more movement. I wasn't sure if I wanted her to emerge or not, but of one thing I was certain: if I got this over with now, I could be back on the highway to Forks by nightfall. With that agonized sigh, I reached a trembling hand to the door handle, only to pull it away again. I did this 4 times before I managed to pull it and open the door. Even then I sat in my seat, nervously tapping the steering wheel and huffing so frequently that it nearly made me lightheaded. After 30 minutes, I'd managed to exit the car, and I kept my eyes trained on my reflection in my window. I'd the inside of my cheek and raked my fingers through my hair, and wished that I had kept my leather fucking jacket, because it suddenly felt like a really comforting notion. Then, thinking about my jacket made me think of Bella, and I wondered if she was wearing it at that exact moment in lieu of the hoodie. I allowed the vision that thought created to distract me for a moment as I rested my forehead on the cool metallic roof of the Volvo. I imagined my girl walking to class next to Rosalie, swimming in my leather, and occasionally leaning down to inhale my scent. I imagined the sun reflecting off of her hair, and embellishing the auburn red tones that lay hidden beneath the flat brown. I imagined her smiling at something, and I allowed it to transform into laughter. The laughter felt closer, as if right by my ear, echoing through my head melodically, and forcing my lips to curl upwards into an involuntary grin. I lifted my head from the car, and turned, opening my eyes, and allowing my smile to grow into one of silent relief. There she stood, all fucking red and perfect, with the most compassionate and tender expression. I wanted to hold her tight, and kiss her on her red lips. If only I was a few additional degrees of crazier, maybe that would have been possible. Her brown eyes shone, as she gazed up at me and smiled warmly.
You wanted me,
she sighed, seeming rather happy as I nodded in concession. She wasn't real, but I'd be damned if I was going to forbid myself the comfort she granted me at this moment. I needed it more than anything. I always want you, I said, honestly, finally allowing myself to believe that this was my girl, and not some materialization of my incoherency, because it made it better. I tried to ignore the complete lack of pull that the sight of my girl would have normally generated in my chest. I tried to ignore the still present emptiness that plagued me as her red lips grinned. She chuckled, and rolled her eyes, pushing off the car, and skipping forward. Her red skirt swayed, and billowed in the breeze, as she turned to me.
You coming, or what?
She smiled, and I inhaled a deep lungful of Chicago spring air to steady my nerves. She was so fucking perfect, even pushing me to do what she knew I needed, but was too afraid to accomplish on my own. I shuffled to her side, and we stood on the street, both gazing at the yellow door. She kept skipping in front of me, coaxing me closer with her reassuring grins and gentle laughter. When I was close enough to see the grain of the wooden door, Bella and all her red hopped up the 2 steps and turned to me expectantly. My heart began thrumming in my chest once again, and my breathing accelerated. My palms were sticky with sweat as I traveled to where she stood, climbing the 2 steps with apprehension and unease. And then suddenly, I was just fucking there, at the door, face to face with Yellow and my mental manifestation of a girlfriend standing at my side in provocative clothing with an encouraging red-lipped grin. I raised my fist while gazing into her brown doe eyes, and made a million silent pleas, as it lingered in the air. She sighed, and began wringing her hands in an odd gesture of anxiety.
I love you,
she whispered without breaking my gaze, and even though I knew I was just telling myself that, it gave me the strength I needed. My fist met the wood with 3 standard knocks, and my body went rigid in anticipation as I waited. Bella was there, swaying her hips from side to side, red skirt swinging around her knees, and her hands clasped in front of her, lips pursed, and head down. I scrutinized her posture to distract myself, until I eventually heard movement on the other side of the door. My pulse quickened, and my throat contracted with my swallows as I kept one foot planted more firmly than the other, unconsciously prepared to make a run for it. Before this plan could evolve into something I could act upon, the knob turned, and the yellow door opened. My racing heart stuttered, and lurched as I gazed into the open sliver of darkness, and a face emerged. Her eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and she had to squint to look at me, slowly raising her gaze. I swallowed, and felt my fists clench of their own accord. My stomach sank, and it was too fucking late to go back, I realized as her eyes met mine. I couldn't have torn my gaze from hers to look at Bella, if I had wanted to, and I kind of did. We seemed to be having some kind of epically pregnant pause. Her eyes were blank, and completely devoid of all emotion and depth, as they stared into mine. It summoned an unsettling sensation that froze into my throat, and forced yet another thick swallow of apprehension. Abruptly, something in her eyes shifted, and the door was being violently swung open. Startled by the rapid motion, I flinched, and braced myself for an impact, though I had no idea what to fear. Instead of the impact I was expecting, she stood in the open door with an expression of sheer panic on her face. She stood for only a fraction of a moment, before she flew forward and grasped my face in her hands. Her eyes became wild and wide as they scrutinized my face, only inches away.
What is your name?
She asked in a raggedly grating voice. I was stunned, entirely fucking motionless and startled by her behavior, as she frantically grasped my face tighter.
Your name,
she repeated in a frenzied whisper. That shook me. EDW, I stuttered dumbly before grounding myself enough to answer completely. Edward Mason. I used the name she'd be familiar with. Her sharp intake of air was punctuated by her body unexpectedly colliding with mine, and I struggled to remain upright as her hands left my cheeks, and wrapped forcefully around my neck. I just kind of stood on the stoop, unresponsive and bewildered, with my hands resting limply at my sides. As she embraced me, I pushed back the emotion that fought to emerge over the notion that my mother was hugging me. If I went there, I'd be completely fucked. From over her shoulder, my eyes drifted to Red, and I was suddenly gazing at Bella's grin. She raised her hands in an expectant gesture, obviously cheering me to return the hug, as my mother clung to me firmly. Hesitantly, I lifted my hands, watching Bella's red lips curl into a wider smile of encouragement as I allowed them to encircle her waist. It was the most uncomfortable fucking hug I'd ever experienced. The awkwardness of the situation had made me still partially rigid, and the stance was only amplified by her stiff and bony figure pressed against mine. We stood for many moments and my discomfort grew, but I was uncertain if withdrawing would be impolite. I decided I really didn't give a fuck. When my hands left her waist and gently nudged her shoulders, I briefly panicked that she wouldn't release me and I'd have to either shove more firmly, or endure the remainder of her whatever this was. Neither option seemed acceptable at that moment. Fortunately, she must have sensed my change in compliance, because she slowly retreated back to the doorway, her eyes fixed on mine the entire time. My chest felt cold and vacant, and I realized I must have been injecting all of my detachment into my cold stare as I gazed at her numbly, but the hug had bothered me more than I wanted to admit, or her to notice. She smelled shitty though, I noted dryly. I heard Bella's soft snicker at my side, and unwillingly, my lips twitched, because goddammit, she'd always have that effect on me no matter the situation. Apparently misreading my amusement, my mother reached for my hand and tugged me gently toward the door with the